Hello and well met. This is Founder Laren with the Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today we're going to discuss NPCs for the DnD5e Ruleset. I apologize if we're not covering other rule sets or genres. However, a little bit of this information might pertain to that in case of other rule sets, but this one is mostly based off of the knowledge that I have. So this is going to talk about different things related to NPCs. We're going to talk about how they're put together. We're going to define them, take a look at the stat blocks, also take a look at some third-party tools and supplements to help you with NPCs. I think that NPCs is one of the more challenging parts within the 5th edition rule set to create as far as data and assets go. You got to also think about the scope of things, like are you going to just modify a PC or create something from scratch, or are you going to do something that is going to be, for a commercial product? So there's a lot of things to consider. So I'm going to dive right into this. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the type of content that you might come up with in regards to modules. So I have some modules already preloaded, and this assumes that you have at least a standard license, some SRD, or maybe the player's handbook or monster manual. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the modules section. And as you can see, I have a bunch of things loaded here. There's a few things in here that are very important and I think would really help a game master out, especially if you don't want to create your own or if you just want to modify existing ones. So we have these versatile NPCs, and then this traps, trammels, and triggers, adaptable NPCs. Most of this stuff is from Grim Press. I think they do a really good job with NPCs. They have a plethora of different books available that you can use that already have NPCs that are fleshed out. And a lot of them are more like characters. So if you ever wanted to create an NPC to look or act or behave more like a character, these books are invaluable for that. They are something that most people come across eventually. They'll start thinking, well, why can't I have an NPC that's kind of like a player character? Well, you sort of can, but you have to have the correct traits on there. And not all of the standard stat blocks come with those traits that you would be looking for. They might come with one or two, but if that NPC is a higher level, there might be other spell slots and those sort of things that would go along with it. So generally, people would just use the NPCs the way they are as is, and they are balanced and created with that in mind. However, you might want to change some things around or add different spells or maybe different tokens or whatever it might be. So on a more basic level, you can basically take existing modules with NPCs in it and you can modify those. Or you can just buy some content that's out there. Like a lot of these are third party that you would get on the DM's Guild. And I have a link in the description at the end of the video for a lot of the content I'm going over. I didn't link every single module in here, but you get the idea of the adaptable NPCs. If you do a search for that on the DM's Guild, you'll find these. But this gives you an array of different types of NPCs that you can insert into your campaigns. Also, they're adjustable. Some of them are templates so that you can build off of them. And then, speaking of templates, if you own Fizban's Book of Dragons, or if you own Tasha's, you'll notice that there's some basically some templates. One is for making sidekicks, the one in Tasha's. And the other is for making your own Drake. So that just really depends on what rule set you're using. But there are some content distributors out there that make templates so that it's easier for you to modify or change or customize your PCs or NPCs. Excuse me. In Fantasy Grounds, you will never get the exact same results as you would from a player character. So as hard as you might try to make an NPC like a character, it's very difficult to do unless you're using some sort of extension. I know there's some stuff out there that will get you a lot closer to making an NPC behave like a regular character sheet. But for the most part, NPCs are kind of toned down. They're not as fleshed out, I would say, as a character sheet. But you can do some pretty amazing stuff with NPCs, and I know that they're very time consuming and they can take a lot of effort to modify or change. So if you're one of those who wants to create a whole bunch of NPCs, be ready for a little bit of work, because there's definitely some things that you need to keep in mind. So that's what I have loaded, are a bunch of different content that I have for NPCs or related. I also have an extension called the NPC Maker loaded. I'm going to show that a little bit. I'm not going to go into the full detail of it, but I'm going to show that. There's some third-party publishers here, like Nord Games. They have this Ultimate NPC Skullduggery and the Ultimate NPCs for Warfare. And then there's also one called the Horde, which is all goblins and such. So that's some really cool NPC resources. Also, like Rob2E and some of the other publishers have put out NPCs that are traps. So when we're defining an NPC, basically the way I look at it is, if an NPC is able to do damage or take damage, it basically qualifies as an NPC. So it can be a trap, it can be a vehicle, it can be a ship, it can be an object that you want to stat out. So it just depends on what it does. So if it's a trap, for instance, you might make the mechanics for it as a note, and then if there's any damage or conditions that are applied after the trap is off, then you can apply that to the combat tracker. So just depends on what your needs are and what your table is doing and that sort of thing. So if you are new to Fantasy Grounds and you don't have any content, you probably won't see a lot of this. But if you do have at least the SRD, if you pull down the campaign banner, which is on the right-hand side, you'll notice there's just different sections. There's one called NPCs. So if you click on that, that will open up a list of NPCs. It won't be as expanded as I had it there, but this is where they will be. So this is like your library, your list of NPCs. So on top here is a group where you can sort through the different content that you have loaded in your library. So if you don't want to look at everything at once and you only want to see the stuff in the player's handbook or whatever books you have, you can filter it out. So if I wanted to look at the SRD bestiary, I can basically add that and have it to where I can only see the content that's in that particular book. The reason you would do this is to filter it out so you don't get confused or mixed with a bunch of other stuff. Because if you look at the group as all, you're going to see everything that you have loaded in your library. So if I go to my library and I open up modules, this is showing everything I have loaded here that has NPCs in it. If I filter it, so like for instance the SRD, then I'm only looking at the 5e SRD bestiary. So that's what that filter's for. So that's good to know that. When you are going to create an NPC, you have to consider what your time is worth and how much time that you want to dedicate to it. So it really depends on how you want to do it. But I think the most easiest way is to open up an existing NPC, take a look at it, see if it's close to what you want, and then modify this. So the way to modify NPCs in Fantasy Grounds is fairly simple and straightforward. If you've never done it before, I'm going to demonstrate that. So I'm going to use the Acolyte as an example because it has spells, and I want to talk about spellcasters a little bit. So basically, I want to turn the Acolyte into a cultist. Now, mind you, there's probably already a cultist NPC out there. I don't know if it's in this book, but there is definitely cultists and other content. But if you don't have that content and you want to make your own, then this is a good way to do that. So what you want to do is, at the moment, if you hover over the little lock on the top right, it is read only, it's locked. You can't do anything to it but read it. You can still parse off of it and cast spells and stuff, but you cannot change anything. So the way to fix that, or the way to use this, is to drag this back into the same list that you pulled it from. So now this is back into the list of NPCs. It's under Acolyte, and here it says Acolyte Copy. And right over to the right, you can see it's not attached to anything. So this is an actual copy of the actual Acolyte. So I'll put the Acolyte over here. This is the original. I'm going to pull up the actual Acolyte copy. And when you make that copy, you can unlock it And you can come through here and you can make modifications as you see fit. You can change the stats around, you can change the alignment, all the notations up here. You can even swap the token out. You can go down and actually change the spells if you want to, which is a process in itself, but I will go through that shortly. So let's talk about the anatomy of a stat block, just so you have an idea of what you're looking at here. So once you have the character sheet unlocked, you're going to go through each one of these fields and get an idea of what they're for. I'm not going to cover every single one, but I do want to go over some anatomy with you with this graphic that I have in the background. So if I take this graphic and open this up so you can see it a little bit better, what I have here is kind of a breakdown of what a stat block might consist of. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on this image, go to view, and go to zoom to fill, and then back it off. So here we go. So on top is your personality, which would be the name of the actual NPC, or if you want to call it a guard, or you can say Guardsman Joe, or whatever you want to call it. On the right-hand side here is the lock. This ID tag is for identifying the NPC in the combat tracker. So if you have this clicked on the red non-ID, basically it will pull this non-identification name down here. So if you want to have a formal name and then just say guard down here, when it goes on to the combat tracker, the NPC will show as just guard and not the actual name. So once the players identify this individual, then you can remove that symbol here and change it back to green, which means it's identified, and that will allow the players to know the actual name or the actual creature or whatever it is. So then you have your size, type, and alignment. That's pretty self-explanatory. The size does matter. It's because if you put small, medium, large, huge, it changes the scale on the combat tracker and the maps. So it'll change the scale of how many squares that your NPCs take. So small and medium creatures only take 1 square. But if you had a large creature, that would be 4 squares. So it just depends on the size. Your type, it just determines your racial things. Alignment is basically what you're affiliated with in your beliefs and your behavior. So that helps with that sort of thing. So then this next section is your secondary data, which is your armor class, hit points, and speed. So these are more mechanical in design. They have, your hit points and armor class and such are your ratings and your points that you have available to you. You can adjust those as needed. It's good to have a little bit of familiarity with the rule set before you change those for balance sake, but basically that's your secondary data. The tertiary data, or the third type, are all these different traits down here. So you have saving throw bonuses, you have skills, if any. If your NPC has damage, resistance, vulnerabilities, immunities, and condition immunities, they would go there. You can also list senses here, such as perception or tremor sense. And then you can list languages. Now, that's kind of up to the setting, but most people have common, and it'll say comma, whatever. Some stat blocks, like this one, says any one language, usually common. So you can edit that and change it to whatever you want. The challenge rating and the XP part is not inherent to Fantasy Grounds. So if you want to calculate something for a new creature or something that you designed, you're going to have to go online, do a little research. There's a formula to figure that out. But it boils down to how many hit points and hit dice they have, what type of abilities they have, do they have spell casting. All those things contribute to the challenge rating and the experience points. So you're going to have to calculate that on your own or take something similar and kind of guess. It doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but that's basically what that is. So the challenge rating XPs are a little bit different, and they're hard to explain, but they're basically based on a formula that comes from Wizards of the Coast, and it has to do with all these little different things that are available to the NPC. Traits, actions, and powers. So these are all the things that will potentially parse or become actionable in Fantasy Grounds. So over here on the right, these are just kind of a blown up thing. So you have your traits, your actions, reactions, legendary actions, lair actions, innate spells, and spells. This is going to change shortly. When it does change, the stat blocks will present themselves a little differently as the DnD5e Ruleset matures and moves on. I know that Smiteworks has already programmed some of that stuff in there, so when the Monsters of the Universe is released with all the new NPCs, if any have a new stat block, they'll be supported in the NPC section. So don't stress too much about that. Also, you have an other tab on NPCs that most people kind of don't look at, or maybe they skip. So it's on the bottom here. If you click on the other tab, generally you'll have a brief description, maybe a link to some artwork. You can do some pretty cool things back here. You can put lore, you can have tables, you can put your loot back here. You can do some pre-canned dialogue. So if you want to add some things, or maybe you have a boss and you want to put a small encounter back here that has your minions to make it more efficient and quicker for the GM to access. So if you pull up the boss, put him in a combat tracker, you can click on his back sheet, pull up another smaller encounter that has his minions if he's able to summon them, and add those to the combat tracker too. So there's a lot of cool things you can do with NPCs with the other tab. But technically you usually get some details about it and you get some artwork. But you're not limited to that. You can, like I said, you can put dialogue back here. You can put a parcel that has treasure in it. You can have a table. Maybe it's a rumor table where they might know some information. And then, of course, their backstory and lore. So it really depends on how in-depth you want to get with NPCs. But that's your basic anatomy of these NPCs. When you start from scratch, it's a lot more difficult to create these because you have to come up with everything. When you actually start with something that's already built, such as this acolyte, for instance, that is something that will save you a lot of time, and it will give you a basis to start with, so you have examples of how this stuff should look, because it does matter on how you word things, especially when it comes to the traits and the actions and the spell casting. These other things are not as critical, although if they're not spelt right or they don't have commas in between them, those sort of things, it could give you some issues. So I'm going to take this basic acolyte and I'm going to change the name to cultist, but I don't want it to actually say cultist. I want it to say humanoid, a hooded humanoid. I mean, that's already ominous as it is, but at least it's not saying cultist right off the bat. And then I'm going to click the item identified thing. So when this gets put in an encounter and sent to the combat tracker, they'll see hooded humanoid, but they're not going to see the word cultist. So that can mean anything. It's a little bit more ambiguous that way. I'm going to leave medium as the size. In this case, where it says humanoid, any race, in parentheses where it says any race, I'm just going to put human, because that's what this individual is. Any alignment. Well, I'm going to say these guys are evil. They're kind of an evil snake cult. So I'm going to put neutral evil here. And then for armor class, 10 is your base. So if you wanted to include your dex bonus and maybe some padded armor or leather, you would make adjustments. So I'm going to change the dex to 12, which gives him a +1. And then I'm going to say that he has basically like leather or padded. So this will be leather armor, probably underneath their robes. And then it'll say plus dex bonus so that the individuals will know where this comes from. So this is manual. This is not automatically done. You have to put this in yourself. So I'm just putting a note here. These notes don't do anything mechanically. It just gives the game master or the person running the game the information, and like, where is this coming from? Why they have this armor class? So this is going to calculate to 12. With the dex bonus plus the leather, their armor class is going to be 12. Now, there are some things that are different in Fantasy Grounds depending on the rule sets. But in 5th edition, you have options which will change the way that you do things or how they're perceived on the combat tracker. So, for instance, when you drag over the hit points, that's actually going to only add 9 as your base hit points. If you want that to vary or you want it to change, you can change that number. So in this case, I'm going to change this to 11 because I want these guys to be a little bit tougher. And then this 2d8 could be, anything, but I'm going to add a constitution modifier. So we're going to have 2d8 plus 1. That's where that would come in. So when we roll, if we do, it will come up with 2d8 plus 1 for the total bonus. So the other thing is in Fantasy Grounds under the options. So if you come over to the right and go to this little dial here, it looks like a gear, and you scroll down, you'll notice some options here. So when you're creating an NPC and you have different things that are going to be added as you put it in the combat tracker, these will affect how that goes. So for this case, if you wanted to change the NPCs to roll for hit points instead of always having the same, you can change that. So there's a setting in here that affects the way that these are counted or added in the combat tracker. So when you have this like NPC rolls and such for fixed, this is basically when your damage is rounded and it will be the same damage every round. So there's different settings here that affect NPCs. I wanted to cover this. So combat numbering is basically when you drag a NPC or a group of NPCs to the combat tracker, it can have different ways of numbering. So you can have it on off, you can have it on append, which means 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of thing, or you can have it random where you might only have 3 combatants, but actually it's going to take and put different random numbers. So it might say 3 of 11, but there's only actually 3 creatures on there. So it kind of will throw off people that try to metagame or that memorize all the stat blocks. The other thing that you can do is change the starting hit points. So when you're in the house rules where it says combat NPC hit points, it says random right now. So that means when I drag these over and put them on the combat tracker, it will add these, if it's in an encounter, it will add these randomly, so not everything will have the same hit points. If you leave it at standard, everyone will have 11 hit points. And if you take it to max, it'll put in 2d8 plus 1, which will be 17. So there's different things you can do to change the behavior of Fantasy Grounds to make your encounters a little bit more flexible and less predictable. So those are settings that you should know and recognize if you want to do that in your campaign. If you're brand new to Fantasy Grounds, I wouldn't worry about it too much, but if you're really wanting that flexibility and the variation, that's where those are set. And what that does is it sets it before you add it to the combat tracker so that it will take in those considerations. So you can vary the hit points, you can vary their actual their initiative, you can vary the numbering system that it uses. So instead of 1 to 3, it might use some random numbers. And you can also change the way the damage works. So instead of 1d4 damage, this hit 2 means that no matter what they do, they're always going to do 2 hit points of damage. And the reason you'd want to do that is to control the amount of damage that your NPCs are giving out, especially at lower levels. Then you can predict, well, after 2 rolls, these characters are going to die. So it kind of gives you a little bit more of a control over the damage range. So instead of having up to 4, you're only going to get 2, but no less than 2. So that is a way that you can mitigate this in Fantasy Grounds if you want to do that. So that is basically some of the things that Game Masters should know if they want to do anything custom and they want to play beyond the data that's actually presented in a given module. So now that we've changed this to hooded humanoid, we've unidentified it. So when we add this to the combat tracker, it's not going to actually show cultist. It's going to show the hooded humanoid until I click on this identified button in the combat tracker, and then it will show cultist. So we changed the alignment. We changed the type to human. We gave it a little bit better armor class. We gave it leather, and it has a +1 dex bonus, so that's added in there. And then we gave it a couple more hit points, and then we added a +1 to their con, so they get 2d8 plus 1 for their actual hit point range. So they can have up to 17. But I averaged these guys up just a little bit more because it was at 9 for an acolyte, so I changed it to 11. Now, as far as this goes, I might change 9 to strength, since to kind of balance this out a little bit. And then the intelligence I'll leave, wisdom I'm going to leave, charisma I'll leave that. So I've only made a couple of slight adjustments, and I'm trying to make this balance. So if I gave them a little bit more dex and con, I took away something else. So it kind of balances out the play a little bit. I don't want it to be overpowered. So traditionally, an acolyte has medicine and religion. So I want to get rid of the medicine part. So when you're in a cell like this where skills are, you're going to notice it turns like blue. And that's Fantasy Grounds picking up on the keyword to parse it. It's hard to select inside or in between these two. So what you want to do is click on the right side all the way to the right so that you have the flashing cursor. Use your arrow key to navigate and just delete what you need. Now I want to substitute religion for persuasion. So I'm going to change persuasion, and I'll do +2. And then to know if you've done it right, if you spell it correctly and you have it parsed correctly, it will parse. So when you double click on this, it'll actually roll the persuasion check. So that's just a way to check it when you're done. And then there's a religion. So I gave them a persuasion of +2, a religion of +2, and I took away their the basic thing that came with the acolyte. The acolyte doesn't have any per se, doesn't have any immunities or anything, but I'm going to give this particular cultist, I'm going to give them resistance to poison. They work with poisons a lot, so I'm going to give them that, which basically they only take half damage from poisons. I don't think it's overly powered. It kind of makes sense with the lore, but it does increase their difficulty challenge rating. So when I'm done with this 1/4 might actually go up to a half, and this XP might be 100 instead of 50. So it just depends on what you do to change this. But here's a new proficiency bonus I noticed here that shows the +2. So that's just showing the overall, that's following the new format of the Monsters of the Universe. So you got quarter challenge rating and such. We added poison as damage resistance, basically takes half damage from poison. Passive perception, I'm going to keep that the same. So it's a +2 because of wisdom, so I'm not going to change that. Languages, I'm going to be more specific. So for languages, I'm going to give this person common, and then draconian for the other draconic, because they are kind of like snake worshippers or some kind of evil cult like thing. So I want to make them have this, basically that those two languages. Okay, so when you have a spell casting NPC, there are two types of spells. You have innate ones, which are things that they can use daily that are not really based on slots. And then you have these slot-based ones, which will basically parse out all the spells. So commonly what I've noticed, and even when I first started Fantasy Grounds, is people will try to add spells to the spell list, and that's not really how the parsing in Fantasy Grounds works. So if you want to change the spell casting on any NPC spellcaster, or even if you only want to modify one spell, what you're going to notice is that it's not as simple or as straightforward as you'd think. So what I'm going to do is remove the spells from this character, all of them. So I'm going to edit list, and you do have to do this. So I'm getting rid of everything. So the cantrips, all the spells, I'm going to get rid of those. So this is because I'm going to add my own spell list. Now I need to keep this trait called spell casting, but I need to modify the text that's in here. This is where Fantasy Grounds actually looks at the data. So I'm going to hit Control Copy or Control C or Control A to select everything, then Control Copy. And then I'm going to open up a note or some kind of thing that I can use to reparse this. So if I come into my notes here, and I'm just going to hit Control V, which is paste, that is the spellcasting statement for this particular individual. So what I might do is make this guy a 2nd level spellcaster, and then I might change the spells around. Or in this case, I'm just going to change one spell. So you have Bless, Cure Wounds, Sanctuary, Light, Sacred Flame, and Thaumaturgy. So I might want to change those. So if I come over to my spells list under characters and I pull up spells, I want to change some of these spells around to be a little bit more in line with the theme of this NPC. So I'm going to take this spell list and I'm going to go to level 0. And the source book is going, well, the source itself is going to be basically a cleric. And then I'm going to look at these and filter this to just the SRD data, just so I don't have to go through tons of content. So they have Light, Sacred Flame, and Thaumaturgy. So what I might do is change this to change the Light spell. And it's important that you keep the formatting, so the commas, whether it's lowercase, uppercase, all that stuff matters. So I got Sacred Flame in there, so maybe I'll put Resistance instead. And you notice you have to spell it exactly the right way and have a comma after it. And then for the 3 spell slots at level 1, I'm going to change this to level 1. And I'm going to change Bless to Bane. And then here's Cure Wounds. Let's see, we have Healing Word. Here's Inflict Wounds. So we're going to change that to more of an offensive thing, Inflict Wounds. And then they have a Sanctuary spell, which I don't think they want. So I will change that to probably, let's see, Command. That's a good one. Okay, so we just switched the spells that they were going to have. And like I said, if you wanted to change the level, you have to change the statement. So you could say instead of saying the Acolyte, now I'm going to change that to say the Cultist, which is just flavor text, but it is a Cultist. It's no longer a Acolyte. And you could say its spell casting ability is Wisdom, which that's not going to change. But you're going to say is a 2nd level caster, which would give it more spell slots and such, but I'm not going to change that, but that's how you do it. And then it says the Acolyte has the following spells prepared. So these statements are important, but I'm just going to say Cultist has the following cleric spells prepared. So that's all I did, is I changed a few things around, reworded it. Now I'm going to copy and paste this. So I'm going to hit Control or highlight the text, hit Control Copy, and I'm going to come back over to the NPC that we're working on, hit Control A, and delete the content that's in here. And then I'm going to paste the new data that I just edited. Now, as you can see, there's no spells on here, nothing. So what you need to do is lock the character sheet. What I'm going to do is make a copy of it by dragging this link from the top left corner down to this hot link so I don't lose it. And I'm going to close it. When I open it back up, if I did everything right, the spells will reparse. So if I open this back up, there's all the spells. They're re-added all at once. So when you make a change to spell casting, it changes everything. Basically, when you close it and reopen it, it tells Fantasy Grounds to look at this statement and parse this information in here, and it will automatically look up the spells and add it to your sheet. So you don't change anything in the spells here. You modify the spell casting statement. Now you have to delete this spell casting statement and all the spells first, and then you make your changes. And what I normally do is just copy and paste the existing spell casting, make my modifications, replace it, lock the sheet, close it, reopen the sheet, and then that triggers Fantasy Grounds to relook up the spells. So it's kind of a process to do that, but that's how it works. So if you ever wanted to change spells around or anything on your character sheets, that's how you do it. Now, if you're going to add anything else, like maybe in this case, I'm going to change the weapon. So this is a really simple change. So this isn't going to be very difficult. So this action is basically an attack. They're calling it a club. So I'm going to change this to Snake Staff or Snake Mace. So it's going to be a mace. And instead of doing 1d4 bludgeoning, it's going to do 1d6. So all I'm going to do is change the 1d4 to a 1d6. and then the hit number is going to be 3 instead, because that's the average. And that's all I'm going to change there. It's really not changing much. It's just changing some of the description and the damage. And that's all I have to do. And that actually changes the damage type. If you want to create your own, there are strings that I'll go through that help parse the sheets and such. But that's basically how you would modify the cultist. And then on the back, where it says acolyte, you can change this to cultist. You can put in the lore. So it says cultists are, you can just change the wording or, put whatever you want in there. So that is basically how you would modify a character NPC type. So you would just go, or any NPC, you would go into the NPCs, you make a copy of it because you cannot edit the original because it's read-only. And then you unlock it and you go and make your changes based on what you need. That's basically how that works. So if you've never done that, that's basically how it goes. So that's the hard part, I guess, of doing NPCs, is kind of messing with the spell casting. It works the same way with innate spells. You would just have a different statement here. And you can have both, but you have to put, spell casting is one trait, and then the other trait would be innate spells. So just depends on what you're doing and what kind of NPC you have. So I'm going to close these for now. I already have the cultist bookmarked, so I might use them later. And let's go into the actual parsing. So parsing is the language that Fantasy Grounds uses when it needs to create actions or set up spells like we were showing before. So the built-in Fantasy Grounds parsing engine within Fantasy Grounds Unity is what parses the text from the context function within the text fields. And then Fantasy Grounds latches on to certain keywords, and it creates effects from those words. However, the words themselves are not sufficient. It is also the context in which the words are found that is important. The reason for this is that if an effect were to be produced every time a keyword was recognized, then there would be a voluminous number of false positives, which would be very messy and very undesirable. So that has to do with the way that the Fantasy Grounds looks at text, and it kind of it looks at the strings and then it will parse it out. So parsing is essentially that blue highlight you get when you highlight over different things on your character sheet, or in this case, the damage or the attack roll. Those are parsed when it turns blue, basically. And those are rolls. So there's your persuasion, there's your religion roll, and then for your spells, you have to actually do most of that on the combat tracker, and they'll have a list of spells. So if I pull up the combat tracker and I put this individual on the combat tracker and I identify that, now it says hooded humanoid, because remember I set that up as non-ID. But if you wanted to identify that, you could click on the little icon and now it says cultist. So then if you open up their attack matrix, which is this sword icon here, it has all the spells listed and all the parsable effects. So everything on here is parsable if it has the blue highlight. So these are saving throws, attacks, damage, that sort of thing. So those are the effects. So without the parsing being correct, those don't work properly. Then it'll just be text. So that's what this parsing is. So there's weapon attacks. In a certain way, they have to be written. There are saving throws. Those have to be written a certain way. You have conditions, which might be like, if you do this, then that, and it will apply a condition, like maybe poisoned. There's ongoing damage, where sometimes bleeding and wounds and poisons might go over a period of time. There's immunities and resistances. We put a resistance to poison on our cultist. There's traits, so it depends. Like there's regeneration. There's the spellcasting traits. You can make a trait called magic weapons. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you can put in the traits, but they have to be written a certain way. And this document I have here is hosted on the Fantasy Grounds forums. So just look for NPC traits and such, and you'll dig in the forums and find the link for it. Or you can come into the college and grab our PDF. So here's the spell casting thing that we talked about. And it says that if the NPC has innate spellcasting abilities, then replace the heading with innate spellcasting and replace the first, second level, etc. with 3 per day, 1 per day, or whatever the NPC rate of casting is. If you want to override the automatic calculation of spell saves and auto attack, replace the first line that says the NPC is the whatever level spellcaster. If the spellcasting ability, and you put the ability in, spell save DC with a number plus whatever the 2-hit for spells and saves, and then the NPC has the following spells prepared. So that is where the spellcasting statement comes in. So this is just some of the parsing that the examples of that. So like for attack rolls, you have melee and ranged. And then each different attack roll can have different damage type. If it's melee or ranged, then it would be like a thrown and a melee weapon. So like a knife or a spear can be done that way. So some of them are a combination. So melee or ranged, which will show both the thrown and the melee. And then there's sometimes where you might have 2 types of damage. So you would say hit, and then damage plus the other type of damage. So if you don't put that plus in there between the damage types, then it's not going to parse. So you have to be careful how you word these things. So that's just some of the things that you might run across with NPCs. Now, once we get through that, I want to go through, let's see. We did that. We talked about that. Okay, so encounters are something that you want to get used to building in Fantasy Grounds. So encounters are basically a collection of NPCs, or it could be one NPC. So earlier when I was showing you to add this cultist here, this is not the ideal way to do this. You can do this, no big deal. It's not the end of the world. But it doesn't attach it to anything that makes it easier for you to reward your players with a certain amount of experience points. So I'm going to delete the cultist off here for now, and I'm going to add it to a random or a planned encounter, depending. So I will first do a planned encounter. So usually in this group, I'll create my own group just so I have some separation and order. So when I click the green plus button here under this group section, it makes a group called Group 1, which is a default title. So I'm just going to put my NPCs, because that's where I want to store, or my encounters actually. So that's where I want to store this encounter so I don't get confused with the other ones. Now that I have that selected, you can right click and create a new item, or you can click this green plus button. Either way works. So here's a new encounter. All I'm going to do is pull up the hooded NPC and drag and drop it onto this new encounter. So just drag this over. And as you can see, it inherited the NPC name. It inherited the token if it has one. And it's 1 right now. So I might change that to 3 just for the strength of the encounter. I'm going to hit the refresh, which pulls from the NPC stat block. So now it's a CR1 and worth 150 XP. So that pulled from the actual stat block. And then I'm going to call this Cultish Ambush, because that's the name of what I'm going to call this. So this makes it a little simpler for when you're going to run an encounter, and it's going to be more than just 1. But even with just 1, you still want to make encounters. So what happens here is, now that I have this, I can also generate loot because I have an extension that is on my table. So there is an extension called NPC Loot. This is a tool that you could use to make things a little easier for you. So if you click the loot button, it's going to name or pull stuff from the combat tracker and build a parcel of looted generation items from those records. So if anything in here has, anything like this has any loot potential, like armor, weapons, anything like that, it'll create the parcel. So if I click on this, it pulls up a parcel. Well, there's nothing on here because the cultists don't have anything of value in here. So it's just a matter of how you use this. So that's just a little add-on that I'm using. The other thing is to take this when you're done with the encounter, so let's say you put this on the combat tracker, and now there's 3 of them on here, and you've completed the encounter, let's say you've defeated them or chased them off or whatever, then you would come over to the party sheet after the encounter or when your game session's done, and go to XP, drag this encounter into the encounters area, and click award, and that will split up the experience amongst the party members that are in your group. So that's why you want to use these encounters. It makes it easier to award XP. It also makes it easier to organize, and you can just link this to a map or to a story entry instead of pulling over individual NPCs, because those make it to where you have to do everything manually. So that's just a suggestion. You don't have to do that. The other thing you can do is you can make encounters scale based on the number of PCs. There's all kinds of really cool stuff. So the next thing I wanted to bring up was there's a tool out there that they're going to start getting into the resources to help you with NPCs. So there is a tool that's out there. It is a third-party extension, and it's called the 5e PC Maker. So this is built into Fantasy Grounds, unlike the Fantasy Module Parser, or FMP, which is a third-party application that can be loaded outside of Fantasy Grounds, and you can build modules, NPCs, and such with that tool. The only thing I want to say about that, or anything else I'm showing you beyond this, is it's subject to change. So if you use these tools to create your content, be wary that if you're in the middle of a project, don't start with a new or don't continue with an old project with the new update. So in other words, stay on the same version of whatever you're doing, finish your project, export it, and then update. Because what will happen is sometimes the tools will break, or Fantasy Grounds will update, and the person who made that won't get around to it right away. So you got to be really careful with that. So if you're creating data and you have a big project, finish the project out before you update. I don't know how many times people have messed themselves up doing that. And that includes the Fantasy Module Parser. If you're using X version, finish the project out with X version unless you can't. And that way, once you export it, you're done. You don't have to worry about if you update and ruin your project. So be careful with that. So this Fantasy Module Parser is an extension and a module. So I have to go into the modules area, and I want to make sure I have the module loaded. So here's the NPC Maker. It does have some template NPCs that you can look at, and it has a reference manual. So if you ever download any of these things, most of them will include a reference manual, and this is basically how you use the product. A lot of people skip that part, so try to read before you go crazy. So brief message is you have to remember that in this case, there's an extension called the Fantasy Grounds in the Fantasy Grounds launcher. Challenge ratings are difficult to figure out. This tool serves to help reduce that workload, but be aware that CR calculations do not make up the NPC CR alone. Many situations can change depending on how difficult PC is, blah, 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 so on and so forth. So this is something that they had to put in as a caveat, but if you want to go online and look, there's some tables or some calculators that'll help you. So creating an NPC stat block. So these are when you're going to have CR modifiers. This is what's getting into creating the stat block itself. So this is saying I don't have the DM's guide open, so I'm going to go ahead and activate that because it pulls some information off of that. There's things that you have to keep in mind when you are creating stat blocks, and it's difficult to do in Fantasy Grounds because there's no built-in mechanism. It just pulls the information from the standard stat block. It doesn't have a calculator that you can use within Fantasy Grounds to recalculate CR values and experience because it's so volatile and different for everyone. So that's where this disclaimer comes in. I was mentioning that earlier too. So if you want the CR value and you want the actual XP, you need to go online and look up the tools. There's calculators, and forums and all kinds of things. You can even go online and look at YouTube, and they have different ways of coming up with this data. So it's just a matter of what you are doing and what the sort of things that you want. So when you create a stat block, you're going to go through this list. It gives you kind of an idea of what you need to do. This comes straight out of the looks like it's the Dungeon Master's Guide. So it kind of gives you a rough breakdown of how all this stuff works. So these are just examples of the things that you need to look at. And then when you do your actual creation, you have a drag and drop feature. It says, take note that there's a button above the HD section that will change how to handle the HD when dropping an NPC or template into the main window. So I'm just going to kind of show what this thing looks like. I'm not going to go through what it does, but basically I have the extension and the module loaded. So when you pull up NPCs, there is a button that's created from the extension and the module called NPC Maker. So if you pull that up, this is basically your tool that you can use, and then you can pull up this template. So like earlier, I was using the Acolyte. So if I can click on the Acolyte, this will be my template. And then you drag the NPC into the NPC Maker to get a large amount of its information automatically. So you can actually drag this in there and it'll do it. So once you have that, now this would be another way that I could have modified that same thing I did manually. So you can create an NPC, you can create templates, here's the spells. If you wanted to do, like, for instance, traits, you can add a trait. You can create your own. For this, for like if you wanted to add, let's say, there's the HD drag and drop. Let's see, where is the skills? So if you click on this skills thing, it brings up the skills list, and then you can actually assign. It's let's say he's proficient with Arcana. We'll get rid of medicine, and then it'll basically change that for you once you export it. So it has some edited fields that are more like a character sheet, kind of make it a little easier on you. This is where your senses are. You can select or add a language. So if you use this, it drops down from the list instead of having to type it. So it might be Elvish that they speak. Here's all your bonuses and stuff, your damage per round, your CR value. And then when you're done, you would click Create PC, and it will spit out your finished product. So that's a little bit simpler way to make NPCs, but you have to get used to it. You have to kind of understand how it works. But once you get to that, it's great. And then there's a power section where you can search through NPCs in your database and load traits for different actions. So you can search for, let's say, poison, for instance. Let's see if there's anything related to poison. So if you hit that, there's poison absorption, there's a gas trap, there's a whole bunch of things with that keyword. So this will help you come up with traits that are already created, so you don't have to necessarily build them yourself. It's going to pull those off other records. So it's a pretty handy thing when you're doing this. So the workshop is based off creating monster stat blocks from the monster manual, and this gives you templates and it gives you a base, and you can kind of mix and match and build things as you go. So this is an easy, well, I would say easy, more of an intermediate type thing that you can do in Fantasy Grounds. So you can add a shield, or you can change this number in the character builder or NPC builder. So that's just a tool that's available for you. And then the Fantasy Module Parser is outside of Fantasy Grounds. I don't have it loaded, but basically the Fantasy Module Parser gives you the ability to create and edit NPCs outside of Fantasy Grounds. It also lets you copy and paste stat blocks. As long as the wording is correct, it should parse. It works similar to the NPC5e Maker, but it's third party, and you have to export the module and then load it in Fantasy Grounds, and then you'll have your NPCs. But it also does other things now. It does items and spells, so it's a little bit more robust than NPCs. It's based off of the old NPC Engineer program. So basically, other than those resources, like I said, in my modules area, I have all these different modules that have different NPCs. Like some of these Grim Press ones, these adaptable NPCs. If you click on one of these and you pull up one of the NPCs, you're going to get different NPCs in here. But see, like this Acolyte might have a different token, and there might be some things that you can use this for to build as a template. So that might be something you want to do. But then they also have like the Bungling Burglar, which might be something that's more unique, but it has some things that are basically attributed to different variations of NPCs. So that, like, here's a Crystal Seer, a Corpse Collector. So you have all kinds of cool different things. And here's a loot button. So there's all the loot that comes from the NPC. Again, that loot button is a add-on, which is the NPC loot button, which will pull from their items list and anything associated with that character. And here's all your other information. So it just depends on what your needs are, but there are a ton of assets out there that give you NPCs, so you probably wouldn't even have to build any. But here's one called Brawler, Bandit, Brigand, Bard. So there's 70 NPCs and the tools to make more. So if you read the reference manual, it'll talk about NPC classes. It'll talk about how to build these things, how to assign them, add a trademark feature, how to choose your race. There's steps on here that helps you determine how to build and change. And then here's the codex. So you have different chapters in here, and this is where non-player characters, it talks about PCs equal PCs. So NPCs are very different from their player counterparts. Build an NPC with a player's handbook, and you come away with unnecessarily complex and overly long stat block. So you want to face the fact that NPCs have their own secret rules, from the lowly commoner to the powerful archmage. NPCs are virtually limitless in their variety, yet usually simple enough to fit in a half-page block. So you don't want to make the stat blocks too complex, because then you have to decide maybe you should make it a character if possible. So it's just a matter of your needs. But just keep in mind that it takes a little work to do NPCs in Fantasy Grounds. There are lots of resources out there, and the quickest and easiest way is just to make a copy of an existing NPC and adjust it, rename it, whatever you want to do. So I did that earlier with the cultist. I started with an acolyte, and now I have this cultist. So that is something that you can change or work with, and this can be added to your own homebrew game. So I just kind of built this on the fly as I was going. But if you wanted to organize this into a module in the actual NPCs area, I would create my own group. So right now I didn't make one for this, but there is one called NPCs, but that's not the folder that I was working in. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Edit Groups, click on the green plus button, which will add a category. And in this case, it will be NPCs. I'll put my NPCs so it's different and I don't overwrite something that's already there. And then this way, anything that I build is going to be in that group. So now that I have the group, I'm going to look for my cultist, or I can drag this cultist in there. So if I go to my NPCs, drag this cultist in there. Now this cultist is part of my collection that I have added to this list. So let me go through here and make sure. So I'm going to click on all, and I'm going to type in cultist, because I'm sure there's others that are named that. So I want to make sure I grab the right one. It'd help if I spelled it correctly. So here there's plenty of different occultists, but here's the one that I made, and then there's some that come from the other books. But here's the cultist. This is the one that I modified. These other ones are from other sources. You can't modify them unless you make copies of them. So anything that you've created, or sometimes third-party stuff, like this occultist from Slinker, Sailor, Soldier, you can unlock it because it wasn't created as read-only. So some of the official content is read-only. Some of the third-party content is open. You can you can adjust it. So it just depends on what you have. So hopefully that helps you guys a little bit with NPCs. There are tons of videos and resources. You just have to know where to look. The parsing thing comes with time. I wouldn't worry about it too much, but you do have to keep that in mind if you're going to add your own spells or your own actions or traits. So you got to kind of get used to Fantasy Grounds when you start messing around with that. You can assign your own tokens. One thing I recommend about tokens is if you don't want to change the base token, so for instance, if you like this cultist, he already has a token. But let's say you don't like the token or you want something different. So rather than changing it here at the NPC level, you can change it at the encounter level. So in other words, these cultish NPCs, when I first made this, they inherited the NPC token. But if you want to replace that token, you can do it at the encounter level instead of changing or overriding the standard one. So I can go into my assets, and I would go into my tokens, and then I can go in and I can search, or in this case, I'm just going to grab something. So I'm going to go into the data folder, which is where I have a lot of my content. So if I wanted to use one of my, custom tokens in this case, then I could do that with just selecting something out of here. So here's some humans here. Let's see what we have for choice. So here's a bunch of humans. So I might make this guy or one of these NPCs the cultist. Here's one with a mace. So I can drag and drop that to change that. So if I unlock this and I drag and drop this token on the master token here, it changes all the tokens. So that way I don't have to actually change the token from the base. I can just use it for this encounter. So that's something you can do to kind of keep your NPCs clean without changing all the artwork. So anyways, take care, everyone. You have a good afternoon, and I hope to see you around in the community. I think the next class I'm going to do is going to be towards the end of the month. This is the March 9th, 2022. If you're seeing this in the future, I think I'm going to run a map class towards the end of the month. I think the 28th or the 29th. So take care, everyone. Don't forget that we have the David Middleton Memorial Con coming up, which is in honor of Digital Dave. That will be happening in May on the 13th through the 15th. We have a Warhorn group setting up so we can organize it. If you're already streaming games or you're already running stuff online, consider putting the fundraiser link on there, which is for a non-profit thing, so it's not going to anyone particular. And then there's going to be Dungeon Master May is going to definitely be cool because it's basically going to focus on DMs. We have some pretty cool guests lined up, and I'm working on more. And in April, we're going to do a Free League Publishing / Alien type